At 18, Clara Whitmore left everything she had ever known and arrived to find not a white settler at the station, but an Apache chief waiting to marry her. What he did that night shocked everyone. The summer of 1874 had been hard on the valley. The sky for months had offered heat without mercy, wilted maize in the low fields, cattle with hollow ribs, the church bell tolling for men taken by fever and for fields that had yielded nothing. Reverend Whitmore had been the one who kept the church roof from falling and the town's scraps of charity from blowing away, and when sickness took him in a week, the whole household seemed to fold on itself. Clara had been left with his Bible in her lap and a pocket full of days that suddenly had no plan. Aunt Miriam moved like a force of business through the grief. She pressed for action as if stitches could hold what grief had torn. "This town will forget us," she said, her voice practical as a ledger. "We have the house mortgage, a name in the paper, and no man to sign for us. A woman alone in a place like San Miguel either starves or marries. There's no romance in it, Clara, only survival." She produced the notice with the same calm a midwife might use to square a board. A matrimonial advertisement for a certain Samuel Crow, a settler in the territories, willing to take a wife in exchange for the security of his land and the expense of a dowry. Aunt Miriam's eyes sharpened. "He'll sign papers, keep the mortgage at bay, and you'll be safe. It's the only sensible thing." It felt to Clara like being sold on a ledge. They had no money. The sheriff's letters had been kind, but kindness didn't stack wood. The town's pity was a thin thing, apt to wash away when rain came again. She remembered her father's hands on the Bible, the way he had read scripture aloud for the fevered and the frightened, and she remembered, too, how he had stood in the doorway of their parlor and told her once, gently, to be brave in small things. He had not said how to be brave when someone else decided the shape of her life. On a brittle morning, with a thin carpet of dust on the train platform and a sky that promised no mercy, Clara wrapped her father's Bible in oilcloth and climbed aboard a westbound coach. The train smelled of coal and grease and human urgency, the metallic tang of travel and the muffled creak of ambition. Out of the window, the land traded green for ochre and the trees thin to scrub. Clara watched people come and go, exchanging coins and courtesies like passing weather. She practiced how she would introduce herself. Clara Whitmore, preacher's daughter, removed and grateful. She practiced not crying. She practiced the polite smile that fits into uncertain hands like a glove. On the train, she was small and private and full of other people's plans. She read her father's Bible by the light of the compartment and imagined the reverend's voice on each page. He had always been a man who could bury a sermon in a joke, and then, when the pews were empty, speak the plain truth. She thought of his voice as the train shuddered and the world slid by. Words of patience and steadiness, the ones you say to a scared child who has to cross a river. When the train finally eased into the small western station, San Miguel's platform was less a hub than a scattering of souls. Men in dust-stiff coats smoked, and a few women with tightly pinned hair stood like small flags of endurance. Clara stepped down into sun that hit like a palm. The town was stitched to the red cliffs beyond, low wooden buildings and a church with a flaking bell. There was a sense of places that survive by stubbornness rather than beauty. A dog nosed at a scrap of meat, and a child chased a tumbleweed along the boardwalk. Her escort, Aunt Miriam, was already there with her boots up and her determination folded like a map. But the man who had come to meet them was not the one Clara had pictured from the pages of matrimonial notices. He stood a little apart from the crowd, broad shoulders in a field-stained coat, hair like a black river coiled at his nape, eyes that took in the horizon as if measurement of the land came naturally to him. He moved with a quiet that had rhythm, as if his steps had been practiced to the beat of desert wind. Around him, Several men who were clearly his people, men who carried themselves with a confidence born of knowing how to read the land, watched the exchange without hurry. Clara's mouth went dry. She had pictured a man in a shirt stained by dust, perhaps hollow-eyed from worry, someone like the parishioners she'd known, settlers who pulled fences and cursed locusts. She was not prepared to see a man with the bearing of a leader, the line of him carved as neatly as an arrowhead. Aunt Miriam smiled with the smile of someone who has already made a bargain and will not be moved. "This is Samuel," she said, and the name fell between them like a coin. "Samuel Crow." The man tilted his head. There was a moment where the sun seemed to gather and hold its breath. He stepped forward and offered the only gesture immediate to him, a formal nod, and then, with deliberate English, "My name is Nantan Lobo." The syllables were measured, and when the name unfolded into the air, it was not the rapacious thing she had expected. Nantan Lobo, Apache name, which Aunt Miriam translated quietly for Clara as if explanation could smooth every fissure. Beside him, a younger man, his brother, Clara would later learn, shifted his weight against a saddle, watching with the watchful stillness of kin. Clara had read about the treaty talks in the newspapers that still occasionally came to San Miguel, wrapped in the crumbs of other people's concerns. She understood, in the clear glint of that moment, that the marriage was not simply a man taking a wife, but part of a larger bargaining. Land, safety, a fragile agreement between communities that both feared and needed one another. Reverend Whitmore in his parlor would have called it a sobering intersection of duty and grace. Aunt Miriam called it a way to keep a roof over a head. Clara called it betrayal because she had not been asked, not in the way she had understood asking. Not that someone came with a question and waited for an answer that might be yes or no. The town watched them talk as if a new chapter had been announced. Some faces were curious, others guarded. A boy from the hardware store whispered and then laughed, the sound crabbed and resentful as a scab being pulled. A woman in a sunbonnet looked away. There was an animalness to the collective attention, a silence that smelled faintly of expectation and fear. Clara felt the floor of her certainty tilt. She had come expecting Samuel Crow, a settler name like a patched coat. Instead, she had been handed a man who wore his nation like a cloak and who, in English, introduced himself plainly, Nantan Lobo. He spoke slowly, choosing words as if each one mattered. Then, with an almost imperceptible concession to the world Clara lived in, he added, "I have used the name Samuel Crow when necessary. It makes certain dealings smoother, but I am Nantan." The explanation was not an apology. It was a practicality. Practicality could be cruel or kind, Clara had learned. This felt neither wholly simple nor wholly cruel. They rode to the Apache encampment at the edge of the mesas, a spread of lodges and lean-to shelters shaded by the backs of red cliffs and the long arms of juniper trees. The land opened like a hand. There were children there who paused their play and regarded Clara with an interest that did not yet understand the laws of adult shame. An elder woman watched from a doorway with eyes like weathered river stones. The air smelled of sage and mesquite smoke and the faint iron of horses. Tents swayed gently as if in conversation with the wind. That night, there were not many formalities to their joining. The ceremony, such as it was, folded together the practical with the solemn. Nantan's people did not perform for the town. They did not present Clara to a crowd. Instead, a circle of men and women came close, hands unclenched, and an elder who had hair as white as driftwood spoke in words Clara could not quite follow. Nantan stood with the steady patience of someone who has taken responsibility and knows the weight of it. He spoke to Clara after the elder's words, and in those few English phrases, there was no pretense of ownership. He said, plainly, that the arrangement had been made as a step toward peace and safety, and that he expected to honor the agreement as such. He did not say he had purchased her. He did not say he had the right to command her. He spoke of obligations in a way that recognized them as two-sided. When the others had drifted away to tend fires and boil coffee, Nantan walked her to the edge of the camp where the stars were large as coins. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew the terrain and the seasons. There was a softness in his eyes that startled her, the kind that belonged to a man who had held other people's lives more precious than his own. From within his coat, he drew a small box carved from dark wood, its surface marked by a weather-smooth pattern of lines, like the grain of the earth itself. He placed it at Clara's feet with the care of someone laying down a covenant rather than a possession. "You must know," he said, voice low and respectful, "that I do not force a woman to be what she is not. I will not hold you against your will." The words struck all the same like an updraft. In Clara's life, marriage had been spoken of often as a place where one kept to a role. The notion of anyone, least of all a man in the position of power that Nantan inhabited, offering choice felt like a window opening in a room that had been closed for years. "What is this?" Clara whispered, because the box was a small thing and yet it seemed heavy with meaning. "It is for the morning," Nantan answered. "Open it when you are ready. Inside is a token and some words. Whatever you choose, you will not be bound by shame or coercion in this camp. You will not be taken into servitude. This I promise." He did not say it like a lecture. He said it like an oath. Clara looked at him, and for the first time since the Reverend's burial, there was something in her chest that loosened. Not like joy, not yet, but like the first thaw of winter water finding a crack in a bank. It was a kindness that felt radical. It was also, to her nervous mind, an offering that must be tested. She thought of the wooden box as if it were a small future, dark and engraved, waiting to be opened. The camp slept under the wide vault of stars. Fires curled and died like the tails of great beasts. The land was wide and indifferent, and also holy in a way Clara had never been taught. She lay awake on the blankets and pressed the Reverend's Bible to her breast. She imagined mourning with the box like an exam she had not been told to study for. The box was both a gift and a responsibility. It was a promise that the weight of her life might not be settled by others. They rose, and the days after their joining fell into a rhythm that was at once foreign and oddly like what she had known. Work, tending the animals, mending clothes, cooking over coals. Nantan moved through the day with the economy of a man used to thinking in terms of seasons and survival. He would speak to Clara in English when needed, then teach her simple words in his language as they worked. He showed her how to watch the sky for wind and read the tracks of animals in the damp morning earth where the mesquite leaves still clung with the night's chill. He did not insist on her forgetting her past. Rather, he asked her to add this new life to it. There were private moments that bridged the spaces between them. One afternoon, while she was carrying water, a snake sunning itself on a rock startled her. It coiled, mouthpart twitching. The snake, striped and quick, might have bitten, and closed an ugly tally on the day. Nantan's hand on the rope where her hand had been steadied her. He did not speak sharply or triumphantly. He moved with patient purpose, scooping the snake away with the tip of his boot and easing it into a sack to be released farther from the camp. He looked at her without making her feel small for being frightened. "Fear is for the day it keeps you alive," he said, and Clara understood the words in the way a bell sings true after being struck. It was not pity in his eyes. It was a recognition that the world could be dangerous and that human beings owed each other safety where they could make it. There were the mundane lessons, how to bake a flat bread over hot stones, where to find the wild onions that grew near the wash, which herbs soothed a cough. Nantan's brother, a tall man named Tossa with a laugh like a blade running true, taught her how to saddle a horse and how to hold it steady when the animal refused to be patient. The elder women showed Clara how to braid hair in patterns she had never thought to make, and bit by bit, she learned the cadence of their lives. It was slow work, each day a small step toward the other's world. One morning, as Clara walked the edge of the camp, she found a seam of linen hidden under a pile of blankets. A crimson and gold sash, folded carefully with a small scrap of writing tucked beside it. She did not open it. She took it to the place where she kept her father's Bible and set it there like a thing that belonged to both her past and this strange present. The sash was bright as a wound, too red to be ignored, and its threads glittered like the first light on the river. She wondered if the sash had been in the box he had given her at night. She wondered what it would mean to wear something that marked her as a married woman among these people. In her own town, a woman wore such things as seals of a new identity. Here, perhaps it meant something else, or perhaps the same. The thought made her feel both very young and very old. She did not put it on. She wrapped it in oilcloth and slid it back beneath the Bible, as if she feared the weight of deciding what to do with it. The men of San Miguel did not forget the fact of the union, and the town's stares and whispers drifted out to the camp like smoke. At the general store, a clerk bartered softly about the danger of letting one's guard down. At the saloon, a few men scoffed and made jokes with the thin humor of those who don't know what it is to have everything on the line. The sheriff, a man whose job was to hold the precarious peace together, came to the camp once to speak with Nantan. He spoke in formal manners, watching each other like two men who had learned to balance a tightrope. "We need cattle to move, stock to be safe," the sheriff told Clara once when she happened to be nearby, his voice carrying the weary weight of someone who sees everything as a ledger. "We need assurances," Nantan answered in his steady way that he sought not to hide his people nor to threaten the settlers. "We are here. We take care of our own. We expect the same in return," he said. The sheriff's face tightened. "The men back in town will not be satisfied unless there is proof that you keep good faith." It was an awkward dance of words that made Clara feel the edges of two worlds pressing together. There were small, dangerous undertows beneath the surface. Some of the settlers resented the land the Apache used for grazing. Some thought the treaty was a bad bargain. Others feared only what they did not know. Once, a wagon passed near the camp with a crate of goods bound for San Miguel, and a driver let go of a string of insults before his horses could leave. His words were not aimed particularly at Clara, yet they landed there like pebbles thrown into a shallow pool, each ring of sound touching her. In the first week, Clara's anger at Aunt Miriam's arrangement softened into something more complicated. Aunt Miriam had not been cruel with pleasure. She had been cruel with calculation. Clara could see that Aunt Miriam's decision had been born of panic and of a desire to keep the household from being taken by strangers with bills unpaid. But that did not absolve the fact that the choice had been made for her. Nantan's offering of the box, his insistence that she had choice, reverberated like a promise she had not expected and could not yet claim. On the fourth night after the wedding, the camp gathered to mark the passage of the moon. There was food and the sound of drums in a measured human rhythm that made sleep come with the slow certainty of tides. Clara sat with the elder women by the embers, while Nantan stood a little apart, his profile against the stars. Tosa laughed at something someone said, and a child practiced throwing a lariat with the clumsy joy of learning. At some point in the evening, while the drums slowed and the sky turned to that deep, quiet blue that feels somehow sacred, Nantan came and sat beside Clara. He did not speak immediately. He merely looked at the horizon where the land fell away in long breaths, and then he reached into his coat and drew out the wooden box. This time he placed it in her hands as if transferring not an object but a decision. "You do not need to open it tonight," he said softly, "but I want you to know truly what is inside." He did not pry the box open by himself. He gave it to her, opened. Inside lay the crimson sash folded like a sleeping bird and a small, tightly rolled paper bound with a thin strip of leather. Clara's hands felt as if they belonged to someone else as she reached in and unfolded the letter with slow gentleness, because the shape of a letter sets the measure of its maker. The words inside were not long. They were plain and honest. In them, Nantan wrote that marriage for his people was a matter of duty and honor, that his promise to the treaty was not merely one of land, but of safety and future trade for both communities. He wrote, too, that he would not make the woman he married into a thing to be owned, that if she chose to leave, she would be free to do so, that if she chose to stay, he would ask only for partnership, not obedience. The last line read, in clear, careful script, "A promise kept is better than fear. Choose by your own heart, Clara Whitmore." The shock that had been in Clara's bones when she first set eyes on Nantan swelled and softened into something dangerous. Hope. It was not romantic impatience. It was the dawning of an idea that a human being could offer her dignity, even while politics and poverty had seemed to take it away. She held the sash, its crimson threads catching the firelight, and did the strangest thing. She let the letter and the sash burn into her memory, as if sealing them there. She did not speak. For a long time they watched the embers and said nothing, hearing only the small, true noises of life around them. Word of the gift and the promise spread slowly through the camp and, like seed downwind, to the town. Some met the idea with surprise, others with suspicion. Aunt Miriam sent a stiff letter back to San Miguel, her handwriting like the edge of a blade. "He seems honorable enough," she wrote, "but you must not forget why you went." The sentence sat like a stone in Clara's chest. The reason she had gone, survival, was unchanged, but now, beneath that necessity, a new current moved. If she were to leave or to stay, it would be by her choice. There were small revolts of loneliness, of course. Clara missed the Reverend's careful cadences, the way he would read aloud and tuck his sermon notes into the Bible with a clean finger. When she felt the old ache, she opened the Bible and read passages as if retracing her father's voice. The Apache women would sit with her then, and while languages were imperfect bridges, kindness found its way in the space between words. They exchanged tasks and humor and stories, some of them old as stone, some as immediate as the last rain. Clara learned not just new words, but new ways of measuring time, not the clock that marks depositions of hours, but the cycle of planting and harvest, of the moon and the migration of game. At the edge of those first warm weeks, Clara's senses of town and camp began to rub together in fits of uneasy commerce. Some merchants found new markets in the exchange of goods and labor. A blacksmith in San Miguel agreed to trade the iron that repaired wagon wheels for hides and labor. A few ranchers discussed shared grazing rights with guarded nods. These small, practical negotiations made some think that perhaps the treaty and the marriage were less monstrous bargains and more the beginning of arrangements that might spare lives. Others, however, used the uncertainty to press fears into sharper shapes. One afternoon, a rider came in from the far road with news that made the blood in Clara's ears drum. He spoke of a string of missing cattle, beasts that had wandered from nearby ranches, and of a burned outpost on the way to the next town. Fingers were quick to point where fear wanted a target. Suspicion is a hungry thing. It arranges the world to fit its appetite. The sheriff called a meeting in the town hall. Townsfolk packed the benches like painted fish crammed into a bowl. Rumors are the country's currency. By evening, they had billowed into accusations. What had been small talk in the saloon hardened into something with teeth. A few men whispered that the Apache were raiding at night and driving off livestock, that the marriage was a trick, that treaties were a ruse. Clara heard the words at the woodpile, in the hush of the general store, on the benches where men spit and polished their grievances with the same stick. Her name seemed to hang between phrases, a kind of punctuation to the sentences of blame. She could have retreated. She could have taken the sash and the box and used her father's Bible to sign for a wagon back east. Aunt Miriam's practical voice would have applauded the return. Instead, a curious thing happened. The box that had once felt like a small, dark future, something to be feared in its unknownness, had become for Clara an anchor. The promise it contained, the simple human declaration that she would choose by her own heart, had changed the shape of what fear could do. She started to realize that if she left, it would be because she had chosen to leave. If she stayed, it would be because she had chosen to stay. The clarity made her feel as if she had been given the reins to a horse she had been riding without knowing its name. Late that night, as wind moved the mesquite limbs like hands whispering in prayer, Clara sat on a small rise outside the camp and watched the town fires flicker at a distance. A small figure, one of the elder women, came and sat beside her without speaking. They watched the darkness and the thin stretch of light that the town permitted itself. It was a curious and not wholly comfortable peace. People trying to see if the world could be made fair by passing agreements and soft words. "You are quiet," the elder woman said in their shared tongue, and Clara, grateful for something familiar, answered in the few words she had learned. The woman chuckled, the sound like a dry leaf, and then pointed to the sash wrapped in the oilcloth near Clara's knees. "You will wear it when you decide," she said. "Not because others say so, but because you mean it." Clara felt the weight of the sash again, human and dangerous and utterly her own, and for a moment she closed her eyes and let the land fill her. There was a horizon beyond which rain sometimes came, and she remembered the reverend's hands tightening in blessing once when the congregation prayed for water. She thought how a community's heart could dry without mercy, and how sometimes survival meant strange bargains. She also thought of Nantan's voice at the edge of their first night together, the offer of choice, the carved box placed down as if it were a work of art he had labored to finish. The act, in its quiet dignity, had been the shock. In a world that often pretended strength meant force, his first gift had been to give her the power to choose. The next morning, the sheriff's voice boomed further than it had any right to when he rode into the camp with 2 deputies. He spoke with the authority of a man who had been chosen by a crowd to keep order. There were questions about lost cattle and the burned outpost. There were accusations thinly veiled in the language of concern. Nantan answered each calmly, as if setting stones in a wall. He showed the sheriff that his people had been out hunting in the other direction that day, offering the names of trappers and travelers who could vouch for them. Clara watched the exchange, the bread she was kneading heavy in her hands. She felt the tension in the air like a taut wire. When the sheriff, finally done with his questions, looked at the small group of women who had gathered near the cooking fires, his glance flicked to Clara. There was something in it like a challenge wrapped in curiosity. "Your people will do right by the town," he said, and his voice carried an unspoken addendum. "Prove it, or be blamed for more than you owe." Clara set the bread down. She could have stayed silent. She could have let politics play out. Instead, she walked forward, her hands dusted with flour, and met the sheriff's gaze. Her voice did not tremble as she spoke, though inside her heart a small drumbeat made her hands aware of their own bravery. "They have been nothing but hospitable," she said. "They offered me kindness when my father died. They tend their own. If there are wrongs, they are not ours alone to fix, but I will not see these people stripped of their good name, because men fear loss." A hush fell, the kind that arrives when someone breaks the line of expectation. The sheriff blinked, as if he had been pricked by the truth of her words. Some in the crowd muttered, others fell away, uncertain which side of the argument they stood on. Aunt Miriam's face was a map of complex loyalties, relief that she had not been forced to watch her niece be humiliated, and a sharp edge of anger that this new life might complicate their account books. Nantan did not move to interpose himself. He watched her, and in his face Clara read something like the small, private vow of a man who would not ask her to hide her voice. The thing that had been called shocking, the box, the offer of choice, was starting to ripple out in ways neither of them could predict. The camp looked at Clara, then not as a pawn, but as a person who had chosen to speak. Nantan's people met her gaze with something like approval. The sheriff straightened, and with a gravity that made the moment feel official, nodded once and rode back toward the town. The deputies followed. That evening, the camp's hum was altered by the drum of news. Favorable words in the town. Some deemed the young woman brave, others called her foolish. For the first time since the Reverend's death, Clara felt an agency she could name. It was small, not heroic. It did not make the world safe. It simply allowed her to act in it. She held the wooden box again that night, the patterns in the wood catching the firelight. Nantan sat across from her, his hands cupped around a tin of coffee. He watched her and then offered, without theatrics, "Take the sash when you're ready." Clara considered it. The choice was no longer theoretical. To put on the sash would mean public acknowledgement, a seal of a union that had once been a bargained item in the town's ledgers. To leave it folded beside the Bible would mean she still held the possibility of leaving. Either decision would mark her. There was, in that knowledge, a terror and a strange, luminous freedom. She did not decide that night. Instead, she rose and walked to the place where her father's Bible rested, and she thought about the Reverend's hands folding the pages and about how he had taught her to hold to truth. She set the box beside the Bible, as if to say to herself that the two things, her past and this new compact, could not be separated easily. Outside, the desert breathed its long night breaths. Somewhere, a coyote called, thin and lonely. The camp slept but was not unguarded. Men and women kept watch in their own small ways. When the moon slid thin across the sky and the wind settled into the stone hollows, Clara climbed into the blankets and pressed her face to the softness. The wooden box lay nearby like a small, quiet animal. She could feel the shape of the world changing, not in explosive gestures but in the slow arithmetic of days. Nantan's offer had been the first incision. Now, the slow stitching up of trust and mutual regard would take time. She was learning to move in a new rhythm, to listen to the sound of a land that held both threat and an odd grammar-like fairness. And yet, as the week turned, the currents under the surface moved. Men in the town, afraid of what they saw as loss, began to look for someone to blame. Items went missing between herding and the town's corrals. A man claimed his wife's silver had disappeared. The rumor mill sped up like a horse spooked by a prairie fire. By the time dawn cut the horizon one morning and painted the mesas with a hard, truthful light, there was a new edge to the camp's talk, an edge that smelled of brimstone and of trouble that could not be whispered away. Clara stood at the edge of the camp, the red cliffs behind her and the faint shimmer of the town on the far plain. She held the box in her hands, the wood warm from having been touched many times. The promise of choice was not an answer to the world's fears. It was, she now understood, the beginning of her work. If she was to keep faith with the box, she would be tested. The test was not distant rumor anymore. It was a future stepping toward them with the shape of danger. She felt in that moment the entire design of her life narrowing down into a small, decisive question. If she were to choose to stay, would she be ready when the world asked her to prove that choice? A dry wind picked up and carried the scent of smoke from the town. Clara tightened her grip on the box and looked past the line of juniper to where dust rose in a long, low curl. Someone was riding fast from the road. Her heart measured the speed and wrote down the letter of alarm. The camp stirred. She did not yet know the shape of what was coming. She only knew that the offering made that first night, the carved box, the whispered promise, had shifted the axis of all the choices in her life. To be forced into marriage had been the town's plan for her survival. The real, shuddering possibility was that she would now be forced to choose, and that her choice would not be an empty. Dust rose like a wounded animal from the road, a column that ran thin and then spread, and the rider's shape cut toward the camp as if the wind itself had taken to galloping. Faces turned. Tosa spit once and moved, bare hands finding leather. Nantan's eyes narrowed, not in fear but in the measurement of what must be done. Stay with me. What happened that wedding night changed everything. The rider pulled up short and spoke in clipped, urgent syllables. Words tumbled out. Fire at the outpost to the south. A wagon burned on the foothill trail. Men riding with masks and black scarves. Outlaws, some said. Others muttered the more poisonous thought. Men hired to make trouble. Nantan listened, then nodded. He did not shout or brandish. He named the roads the riders might take and the likely markers they would pass. He set a small band to watch the gap in the ravine. Then, with a motion that made Clara's heart step into her throat, he told several young warriors to gather horses and move to the north ridge to defend the livestock. The movements were practical, precise, like setting a bone. Night came quicker than Clara expected. A bitter smoke rode on the wind, mixing with sage and the metallic smell of men preparing for anger. Torches were lit. Children were led beneath flaps. The elder women drew their blankets close and mumbled prayers that were older than the town's ledger. There was little ceremony in the work that must be done. There was, instead, an even grim focus. Men strapped on ammunition, checked saddles, and scanned the horizon as if the land itself might split and disgorge enemies. Clara felt the box like a small, beating thing against her ribs. She had learned to cradle it when worry climbed her sternum. Nantan met her eye, and there was the same quiet in him she had seen the first night. A man who held responsibility as if it were a slow, living thing. He came to her as others mounted, brushing dust from the hem of his coat. "If they mean to burn and to break," he said in English, "we will not run to be struck. We will be where the danger finds us first, and we will hold so others may leave." His words were neither boast nor bravado. They were a plan and a promise. Clara felt her muscles tighten, and for a second, the old, reflexive girl inside her wanted to be told to sit this out. Aunt Miriam's practical counsel flickered at the edges of her memory. A ride back east, a headstone of comfort. Instead, Clara put both hands on her skirt and stood. The first wave came like a bad weather front. 3 riders, masks tied tight, guns held at the ready. They rode straight into a line set by Nantan's scouts and were met by shouts, the ring of steel, and a howl that was part surprise and part fury. Sparks flew when a lantern toppled and cracked, and the scent of burning leather cut across the night. In the confusion, a second group circled like dogs and slipped toward the camp itself, their faces hidden beneath scarves. Someone yelled for the women to take cover. Clara saw the flash of a torch being thrown, and a lean shed, full of stored grain and a few of the camp's trade goods, caught immediately, the flames spreading with a terrible eagerness. The children cried out. Men ran, hauling blankets and slinging water into anything that might keep the fire from finding fuel. Clara moved before she could weigh the prudence of it. She grabbed a bucket, filled it at a horse trough, and ran with the others to throw water on the blaze. She felt small and ridiculous and utterly necessary. 2 masked men lunged past her toward the cooking racks. One snatched up a basket of blankets and looked as if he might commit other cruelties. Tosa was already near, his hand a quick blur as he struck at an arm that moved wrong. He did not kill. He disarmed. He wrestled. He used momentum and a hard palm. Then the shout that splintered everything came, "Nantan!" It was a sound that cut winds. Clara turned and saw him, surrounded by a ragged ring of men, forced back as if he had been trapped by a sudden narrowing of the land. 2 riders had taken him by the bridle. Another had grabbed him and forced the chief from his horse. For a moment, his silhouette was all wrong, arms buckled, coat flapping like a banner. Nantan was dragged toward a dust-strewn wagon where 3 men gathered, faces dark with malice. One of the masked men slapped a length of rope across Nantan's wrists. He did not shout. He did not plead. He kept his head as if some inward compass told him what to hold on to. "Take him," one of them said, voice low and meant to be cruel. "Make the sheriff see what he has let in." Clara's heart punched at her ribs. The world narrowed to the rope around Nantan's wrists, and the way his jaw set as if pain were a thing marked but not owned. The outlaws shoved him into a wagon and began to jostle the team to make it go. Then, as a man might throw down a gauntlet, one of them shoved Nantan hard. He almost fell, and then he did fall, out of the wagon, and before anyone else could move, he was grabbed back into the back of the cart, and the driver lashed the mule. The wheels ground stone, and the wagon pulled away like a small, heavy animal fleeing with a prize. Someone screamed for a chase, but the outlaws had horses, and the moon was a thin, unforgiving coin in the sky. Tosa lunged after the wagon on horseback, and a handful of riders followed in close. But the outlaws' team had speed and the advantage of direction. Dust swallowed them. By the time the band returned, all that remained of Nantan was a dark wedge of distance and the smoke of a half-quenched fire. In the stunned silence that followed, a dozen voices rose, some with grief, others with anger that tasted of bright iron. Clara stood, frozen to the spot, the box trembling in her hands. She did not recall how she moved to the edge of the path where the wagon had passed. She only knew that the world had changed into a place that required a decision. "You must leave," Aunt Miriam said fiercely beside her, appearing as if summoned by the blunt need to do something sensible in the face of chaos. "Go with the sheriff. Take the train back east. Take your life where it can be counted and protected." Clara heard the counsel and felt it as a physical thing, the way one feels a draft through a gap in a wall. But the box, warm from where her hands had clutched it, was an anchor. She thought of Nantan's hand setting that carved thing at her feet on their first night. She thought of his words, of choice and honor, and of the small stitch of trust that had been sewn between them. The idea of leaving because fear told her to was suddenly a form of cowardice she could not endure. "What if I don't?" she said aloud, and the words startled even her. "What if I go after him?" Aunt Miriam's face folded into a map of horror and maternal logic. "You cannot ride into men who mean to kill. You are a woman." "I am not a child," Clara cut in. She did not realize she had raised her voice until she heard the wind catching it and scattering it among the tents. "I will not be taken from this place by the fear of others. If he is taken, I will find him." Her declaration landed between people like a small, stubborn stone. Tosa stepped forward then, eyes hard and quick. "You will not go alone," he said. "This is not a thing for one woman to do without help." Clara shook her head. "You do not know this land as I do," she said. "You know it in ways that are not mine. But I know the roads of men. I will ride the back paths. I will find them." Tosa's jaw tightened. Nantan's brother was no fool. He could see the danger like a hawk seeing the line of a rabbit under brush. But he also saw Clara, how she held the box now like a talisman, how her knuckles were white, how her shoulders set to a purpose that was not merely brave, but necessary. "Then you will ride with me," he said at last. Not alone. They moved with quick, efficient silence. A mare that Clara had learned to trust was saddled with fingers that found familiar knots. Tosa's horse breathed hot and heavy, steam lifting against the night. They took what water they could, a roll of bread, a coil of rope. Aunt Miriam tried to offer a last, sharp counsel about returning to San Miguel, but when Clara met her eyes, there was neither pleading nor argument, only a resolve that could not be negotiated. They left as a thin line of shapes bending into the dark, 2 riders and the clatter of hooves. The wagon that carried Nantan had been seen heading for a low ridge and then for the farther canyon where the trail split into a dozen possible gullies. Tosa rode with the careful patience of a hunter who knows the value of restraint. Clara rode with a heat that flattened her thoughts and made her senses bright. The desert was a lanterned world at night, a place of bone and shadow. She kept the box tucked beneath her cloak like a heart. They rode hard, tracing the wagon's thin marks through dust and dried grasses. At times they lost the trail and had to pick it up again by the disturbed sod or by the slight bend of a twig. Once they found a scrap of scarf snagged on a mesquite, and their hopes rose. Twice their faith was dashed by a set of footprints that led to a dry arroyo and then vanished. Clara felt fear as a knotted thing in her stomach, and also beneath it, a fierce, cool clarity that made the shape of her choice visible. When they finally found the wagon, abandoned in a narrow basin and surrounded by a ring of dull footprints, Clara's hands moved before her mind could fully accept what the desert showed. The back of the cart had been opened. Rope lay in a hasty heap. It was clear someone had been taken, but by whom the tracks could not say. There were signs of a struggle, scattered tools, a boot snagged on a root, and a smear of blood on the rim of the wheel. They followed the tighter tracks into a canyon that narrowed as if to pinch off the world. The air turned cooler and smelled of rock and old water lines. At the canyon's mouth, a thin arch of stone cut the moonlight into a natural window. It was beneath that arch that Clara paused, and, for the first time since the wagon's rattling wheels had pulled away, she opened the box. She had read the letter once in the camp, in the softer light of embers, but under the arch the world changed. Shadows made the wood's grain seem to move like living things. She unfolded the sash and smoothed its crimson across her lap. It was brighter than the night should have allowed, a slash of color against gray stone. She read the letter again, the words a familiar map now. A promise kept is better than fear. Choose by your own heart. Clara Whitmore. The letter's lines had a new weight now. Where before they were a comfort, here they were a command. The promise Nantan had made at their first night, choice, honor, suddenly required action. To remain a passive thing because fate had placed her in a bargain would be to hand her heart's agency back to those who would buy or sell it. The sash on her lap felt like an answer hidden in plain sight. She tied the sash around her waist without ceremony. The crimson pressed against her like a vow. It felt strange and right, like a helmet that had been waiting for the one to wear it. Tosa watched without comment, and when she rose, he lifted his hand to steady her. In that motion, his face softened with an approval that needed no words. It was the acceptance of someone who had seen the measure of her choice. They moved on, deeper into the canyon where signs of the outlaws' camp showed low tents and a couple of men keeping watch. Clara's throat tightened. They were few. That was their hope. If the outlaws had thought to hide well, they had not guessed that a woman wearing a bright sash might move like a force they had not accounted for. Clara did not pretend the plan was clever. It was simple, almost primitive. Get close, make enough noise to draw their attention, and create such confusion that someone could slip into the wagons where prisoners might be held. Tosa would ride the outer rim and cut off any man who tried to flee. She clenched the rope in her hand, the grain rough and real, and they crept to a low rise. At the edge of the outlaws' camp, Clara whistled softly, the signal she and Tosa had practiced in the light hours, and then kicked her stirrup away, dropping into the dust and using motion to slide toward the tent. A fire sent rude shadows on the fabric. Voices argued about coin in the next hall. A man stepped out, lantern in hand, and Clara flung herself like a small, surprising animal at him, grabbing his arm and jerking him back. He cursed and spun, and Tossa, on the rim of the clearing, struck the nearest watchman across the back with the blunt left of his fist. Chaos unfolded with the terrible efficiency of a storm. Men rose, shouts cut across the air, and lanterns bobbed like angry stars. Clara moved with a desperate clarity, knotting rope around a written post and hauling, her arms burning, until a wagon door was pried. Inside, under a mound of blankets and a jumble of seized goods, lay Nantan, bound but not broken, his eyes burning with that cold steel of someone who had been given time to think and who had decided to endure. For a moment, their eyes met, and everything that could be said without sound passed through the space between them. Surprise, gratitude, a small, fierce love. He made no move to escape that could endanger others. He simply unstrapped the cord holding his wrists with his feet and, with the quickness of someone who had long practiced making use of smallest motions, reached for the lacing that bound his ankles. Clara worked with him in the close dark, hands finding rope and pulling, until finally he freed himself and rose, steadier than she expected. They had nearly made it when a shout split the night. A man with a smoking pistol turned toward them and fired into the dark. The sound roared inside Clara's ears like a bell. Pain flared in the shoulder of a rider who tried to flee. Tossa swung his horse and struck with the butt of his rifle, sending another to the ground. The outlaws, their bravado suddenly drained by the turn of events, fled in a clumsy scatter, throwing away lanterns and leaving their packs. Then, as if the land itself had chosen sides, a send of hooves beat against the canyon's mouth. A low, prolonged cry rose, an Apache war cry that was not just for battle, but a call for those who could answer it. From the ridge, Nantan's kin appeared, a small band who had slipped around the outlaws' flank and now charged into the thinning ring of men. The fight collapsed into a short, ugly scramble as the outlaws, realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, abandoned the field. A few tried to bargain, but the desert accepts no pleas in the moonlight. No one in the canyon meant to celebrate like a festival. They moved among the fallen, pulling the injured into shade, tending to cuts, checking for broken bones. Nantan's wrist had been chafed and red. Someone, Tossa, had a cracked lip. Clara felt the back of her knees go weak with the tension she had held for hours. She sat on a flat rock and allowed herself a breath that felt like a small surrender to the night. Nantan came to her then, and for the first time since that first night, he embraced her, brief, practical, and not theatrical. It was neither a lover's clasp nor a casual reach. It was a tempered, thankful thing, the touch of two people who had seen violence and had chosen to stand against it together. "You didn't have to," he said quietly, close enough that the softness of his voice was meant only for her. "I had to," she answered. "You gave me the choice. I chose." He smiled then, a small private curve that seemed to make something like sunlight in the canyon's edges. Someone nearby, an elder man from his band, saw them and nodded. It was small, the look of approval that meant she had become not merely someone married by bargain, but a person who had chosen an action and who now shared the camp's responsibility. When they rode back to the camp at dawn, the world felt raw and new. Broken fences had been mended as well as could be, coals tended, and the sheriff had been rousted from sleep with news that made his face a paper map of surprise and irritation. He came, riding hard, flanked by a couple of deputies and a few of the town's men whose convictions were thin and likely to bend. At the meeting that followed the ember's last glow, the sheriff's posture was defensive. He had not expected the outlaws to be driven off by a band he had underestimated. He had certainly not expected a woman to ride into danger and return with the man the outlaws had taken. The town's bench of men who had once muttered about treaties muttered differently now, as if the shape of what they understood might be shifting. Aunt Miriam, fierce with relief and fierce with continuing worry, kept her place near Clara like a sentinel whose job was to keep both the household and the ledger intact. Nantan stood and spoke in measured English, the words he chose like stones in a bridge. He named the facts of the attack. He named the likely culprits, men who profited by stoking fear, and he offered proof. A list of routes, names of riders seen on the trail at odd hours, the outlaws' camp left behind. He did not shout. He did not demand blood. He asked plainly for the sheriff to aid in bringing the guilty to justice so that both town and camp might be safe. The sheriff's face tightened as if he had been challenged in a way that required him to balance political survival with justice. He could not ignore the proof that had been brought to him. To his credit, he offered, reluctantly and with more humility than Clara thought he possessed, that he would take statements, ride to the sites, and make inquiries. It was not the sweeping justice some wanted, but it was something, an offering of recorded law rather than mob rumor. The camp and the town would not be made whole in a day. The loss of goods, the fear sown, and the suspicions that had been fed by the outlaws' plan left wounds not just on fences, but in relationships. But something had shifted. Nantan's capture and Clara's refusal to run had shown the men of the town that these were not a people to be easily dismissed. They were organized, they were stubborn, and they had the grit to claim back what was theirs. Weeks later, in the quieter business of repair and mending, the camp and San Miguel began to find an uneasy commerce. Trades, agreed paths for stock, watch attachments that included both men from town and Apache riders. There were still hard words by the saloon's hearth and at the bar of the general store. But there were also small, practical meetings of men who had to reckon with the fact that survival was shared. The ceremony that followed any hatreds and repairs was not a triumphal parade. It was simple, held in a wash of early light that made the red cliffs glow as if from within. They gathered with no need for the town's staged approval, under the witness of elders and children who had seen too many fearful things. Nantan called Clara close and, in front of the circle, broke the box's lock, not with a hammer, but by placing the small iron clasp in a blackened pot over a coal's heat until it softened. He worked slowly, as if each movement were a deliberate prayer. Then he poured the molten metal through a small mold shaped like a bird, and when it cooled, he polished the tiny pendant until it shone with a faint, proud light. "For when the world is heavy," he said, pressing the small bird into Clara's palm, "you may have a thing that was once a lock become something that flies." She put it on at once. The pendant rested at her throat, a new weight that felt like the intersection of past wounds and future promises. When the elder woman who had counseled her nodded, when Tossa laughed quietly as he slapped a knee, when Aunt Miriam drew a breath that was equal parts exasperation and a kind of admission, Clara felt the seams of her life shift. It was not that all was forgiven or that the town had become a haven. It was that something human had won a place in the middle of the ledger. Choice, courage, duty, honored. That evening, they ate together, settlers and campfolk mixing bowls and sharing small songs that were sometimes translated and often simply hummed together. The children ran with a new care around the fires. The sheriff, when he spoke, thanked the Apache for their partnership, and though the words were spare, they had weight. Men who had once grumbled at Nantan's presence found themselves asking for him when trade needed a steady hand. What had been a brittle arrangement of necessity softened into a relationship held by mutual acts, work done, lives saved, honesty offered at a cost. In the weeks that followed, Clara's days filled with new rhythms. She learned more of the language, more of the ways that land could be read. She taught some of the children to read from the Reverend's Bible, and they in turn showed her how the stars could be read like a map not of miles, but of seasons. She and Nantan spoke often, not as lovers newly set aflame, but as two people who had chosen, often and plainly, to keep each other's dignity intact. He told her of his responsibilities, meetings with elders, negotiations with neighboring bands, the careful economy of keeping peace in a fierce land. She buried her fingers in the soil when the rains came and felt the land's soft response, the way it received and then yielded. Aunt Miriam, slow to be convinced, found reasons to visit that were part habit and part curiosity. She saw how Clara's posture had changed, no longer the girl flattened by loss, but a woman whose claims were both tender and upheld. Between Miriam and Nantan, there developed a practical truce. She used her accounting skill to help distribute trade when need arose, and in return she found her ledger less sharp-edged than before. When settlers and the camp formally signed agreements that tightened trade routes and promised joint watches on certain trails, it was not the tidy solution that a politician might design. It was messy and human and required compromise, but it held. The town and the camp began to trade at fixed points. The sheriff named men for joint patrols. The blacksmith from San Miguel began to take commissions from both sides. These were not miracles, only the small, grinding work of building a shared life. On a day when a storm came and finally loosened the long-held drought, the land seemed to breathe again. Rain pocked the dust and sent up the scent of mesquite and wet stone. The maize in the fields lifted its leaves like hands giving thanks. People gathered in both town and camp in small, good-humored clusters, tending roofs and soaking seed beds. Children splashed in runnels that had been dry for seasons, their laughter high and thin like new bells. Clara and Nantan stood at the lip of a cliff that looked out over the valley. Below, the town's roofs glinted with rain puddles. Beyond them, the red cliffs ran like a spine into the distance. The pendant at Clara's throat caught the light when he turned her by the elbow and pointed to the horizon. It was not an easy path, Nantan said. His voice had the soft patience of someone who measures the world in seasons. There will be men who never forgive, and men who will always look for a reason to break what we have tried to build. Clara looked at him, at the lines in his face that had tightened in nights of worry, at the way his hand rested on a parapet like a statement. She thought of the Reverend's gentle admonitions, of Aunt Miriam's brutal practicality, of the box that had sat between them the first night, and of the night when she had tied the crimson sash and chosen to ride back into danger. "I know," she said, "but I also know what it is to be given choice and then to use it. I could have left. I could have taken the train back and tried to mend a life that would have fit someone else's plan. Instead, I wanted to be the one who chose. That matters." He nodded, and then, after a short beat of silence in which the rain made a small, steady sound, he reached into his pocket and drew something small and familiar. The wooden box, now light and stripped of its iron lock save for the tiny bird that had once been clasped to it. He set it down on the stone between them, its grain warm from the weather. "You kept it," he said. "So did you," she replied, touching the carved lines with a finger. He smiled. "We kept our promises in different ways." Their hands met over the box and stayed there, the touch not flashy but quiet and binding. Around them, life moved on. Repairs were made, disputes were settled, children learned new words, and the town's bell rang out in steady peals that were neither joy nor sorrow but the thing in between, the sound of a community that had been tested and hadn't broken. At dusk, fires were lit, and drums sounded in a slow rhythm that had come to mark both grief and endurance. People gathered to share bread and to trade stories of the months past, of loss, of daring, of the small miraculousness of practical courage. Clara sat with elder women who had once eyed her as an outsider and now counted her among their own. Nantan sat with his kin and with men from the town who had come to offer a hand in repair. When the evening ended, Clara and Nantan walked away from the fires in the crowd toward a stretch of land that ran to the edge of a ridge. There they stood and watched stars pierce the deep, moist sky. The pendant at her throat was a bird against rain-dark skin, and when Nantan took her hand, it felt simple and right. "You gave me the choice," Clara whispered. "You gave me the same," he answered. His English held the cadence of his first nights, measured, honest. "We live by our choices. We keep them." She pressed a kiss to his cheek, then, not a bridal flourish, but a human marking, and the land answered with a faint night sound that was neither triumph nor defeat, but the humble closing of a season. If this story moved you, subscribe for more true field tales of courage on the frontier.